Hey everyone. My article that I had to read this week is by Stephen Ruggles, and it's the decline of intergenerational co-residence in the U.S. from 1850 to 2000 specifically. So, background of his study that was written about in the paper was that over the past century and a half, there has been a significant decrease in the number of aged people living with their adult children. In 1850, nearly 70% of people who were 65 and over lived with their children, whereas in 2000, this number dropped to less than 15%. So many scholars contribute the reasoning for the change because the aged now have more resources and benefits like from Social Security. So this allows them to afford to live on their own. However, Ruggles has a different idea of why this change occurred, and he thinks that it's more based on the opportunities of the young compared to the opportunities of the old, as well as the decline of parental control of parents and their children. So his paper shows how he came to this conclusion. So the hypothesis that's put forth by many other scholars is the consensus or the affluence interpretation. And this basically means that uh, scholars who abide by this think that the elderly wish to live alone from their children. So they want to live independently, and they would only do otherwise if by necessity, if they got sick or they were too frail, in which case their child would move in with them and help out and take care of them. But Ruggles challenges this hypothesis. He disagrees with it, and he uses historical evidence from the census, which found that poor elderly were the most likely to live alone, and those who were sick were actually less likely to live with their children than were healthier individuals. So this goes against the affluence interpretation. Um, Ruggles more so buys into the economic development hypothesis, and this contributes to the decline of co-residence with the rise of wage labor and also the rise of mass education and the decline of house-based production and agriculture. So the young, like in the 1850s, that time, the young were more so attracted to high wages and the independence of the cities. That's when this change started to occur, and so they left towns and left their agriculture. And then with the rise in education, children changed from an asset to a burden, economically speaking, and so children distanced themselves from their parents, and they were less likely to live with them. So that's what that hypothesis kind of states, and Ruggles more so supports this hypothesis. And so his actual research that he did, he evaluated the affluence hypothesis and the economic development hypothesis to explain the decline in co-residence. And the way he did this was through a few certain ways. He examined trends in headship patterns of intergenerational households. Headship basically means who is the householder, the head of the household. And then he also assessed changes in the relationship of occupation to co-residence and whether occupation has had a steady role in the number of co-residents for the younger generation and the older generation. Then he also looked at income of the older and younger generations in the census since 1950. And so he compared the effects of income to intergenerational co-residence for both generations. And then he also added in education to income as well. And he looked at education through a spatial model of research to explain the relationship, if any, of socioeconomic characteristics relative to co-residence. And then lastly, he explored Social Security benefits and if they really did have as much of an impact as a lot of people like to say on independence of the elderly and the decline in co-residence. So this first headship patterns that he looked into, that was basically data showed that in families with an elderly father, headship is mostly designated with the older generation, and Ruggles found this. And this disproved the affluence hypothesis, which says that elderly men move in with their kids because they can no longer support themselves, so that would go against, because in that situation their child would be the householder. But this data shows that with elderly fathers, they are usually the householder. And so instead, it's the younger generation who remained in their household, their parents' house, after adulthood, or they would go off, live independently, but then ultimately revisit their parents' households after some time of independence. And so then, when he looked at occupation, he divided occupations among three status groups: high status workers, which are your professionals, mid status, which are clerical or like craft workers, and then low status, which are your laborers, landscape, whatever, that kind of thing. And so he compared these separate groups with the likelihood of their intergenerational co-residence using the census data. And so he found that in 1850, the younger generation, low status workers, lived with their parents 34% less often than average. But during this same time, high status workers lived with their parents 18% more often than average. So, and this trend reversed over time. So by 1970, low status workers were 50% more likely to be living with their parents, and high status were 43% less likely. So this was a reverse. And so he attributed this change to the economic development hypothesis. He believes it fits the pattern because in the 19th century, many high status workers were so because they inherited a business from their parents, from their father. So it would make sense that they lived in their father's household because they were also working in his business. But by the 20th century, with the high and mid status jobs being replaced by industry and wages and less independent business or agriculture, that those new jobs didn't really come forward by inheritance. So as household production lessened, the incentive to stay at home for this young generation lessened as well. So sons with the most resources were more likely to live independently. And then, so that was a good finding that he found considering occupation. And then in income, with income, he found an inverse relationship between co-residence and income. So in other words, from 1950 to around 1990, the more income that was made meant a lesser likelihood for co-residence and vice versa. And what was interesting is that he found that this relationship was stronger for the younger generation as compared to the older generation male. So then when he added because then he hypothesized that from this, that low-income elders resided with their children more than high-income elders because low-income tended to have low-income children. So it was really the children that were the predictor. And then with the effects of Social Security, he claimed that it might not have been a reason for the decline in intergenerational co-residence, but it might have been a consequence of this family shift. And this is because he attributed the fact that the Social Security creators saw this shift to wage labor that was happening. They saw the decline in farming and saw youth moving to cities as a reason to up the assistance for the aged. They needed more support because the creators of Social Security saw all their kids were moving away and things were getting harder for them. So the shifting living arrangements actually, Ruggles states, was a precursor for Social Security. So I thought that was interesting. A very interesting article, and he covered a lot of different variables. And so I have a couple questions for you guys. One, the article examined intergenerational co-residence strictly in the US. So do you think that co-residence is more prevalent in developing countries? Why not? And then also, based on what we have previously learned in the course, why do you think intergenerational co-residence has shown to decrease with an increase in education? More so for the younger generation specifically. So thanks, guys.